IB Nation, Notre Dame fans, welcome back to the big show. We are back. It's Thursday, February 27th. That's Trevor Trowbridge. I'm Brian Driscoll, and we are going to talk about breakouts, Trevor. We've talked about breakouts before. We're going to talk about breakouts again. We're going to take a little different angle on the breakout conversation today. We're also going to do a daily mailbag at the end of this segment. So if you have some questions, go ahead and get them thrown into the chat. We already have 3 of them in there that we have starred already to answer. A couple from Iden Benami. Jared Rhodes already has one in. If you have a question, just go ahead and put an MB on there or a mailbox emoji, and we'll know that you have a question for us. And we will answer those, any of those at the end of the show. We'll go for at least an hour on those and have some fun. So if you have some questions, you have some things you want to say or you want us to talk about and address, go ahead and throw those in there. But Trevor Trowbridge, today, my friend, we're talking about breakout players for Notre Dame. And we're going to go a little bit of a different angle. We kind of did a brief breakout conversation when we talked about the 25 season right after the 24 season ended. We'll have another dive into that as we get, maybe post-spring. I think we've kind of talked a lot about breakouts for the spring. We'll have some written stuff. I'm sure there'll be some different aspects. We'll dive into that. But what I want to talk about today, Trevor, are breakouts that are more so not predicted as much as needed. And so what we're going to have a conversation today is we're going to look at both sides of the ball. And we're going to say, what are the 2 players that you believe a breakout is most needed for this offense or defense to really take a jump? It can be an individual player. It can be a position where you need someone at position X to step up and play. Actually, I should say unnamed position, because X is actually a position. It's the boundary receiver. But this particular position, you need someone to step up because it's important for insert reasons. It could be a group of guys. These types of players, these guys all have a unique skill set. They provide something. You need one of them to break out. And then why those needs are so important. So we actually kind of both came up with our list of 2 on offense and 2 on defense, and they were both different. So we're going to both kind of explain the ones that we have, and kind of why those are. And it's not going to be like a debate thing like we did on Tuesday, because it's not that kind of, well, this is why mine's more important than yours. It's just your perspective on why you think these are important. I'll give mine on my particular players. I think we're in agreement on all 4 on each side of the ball. It's just looking at it from different points of view. And so I'm going to have some fun doing that. We'll do defense first, Trev, and then we'll go to the offense, and then we'll do our mailbag. So this is going to be fun. I know that the coaches talked yesterday. We heard Chris Ash and Jawan Sider talk. So what we figured we could do is, if you guys want to hear our thoughts on specific things they said or in general comments about it, go ahead and just ask us questions for the mailbag. Go ahead and get mailbag questions in, specifically kind of what you want our thoughts on what they said. We both listened to the press conference. Trevor transcribed it. I listened to it last night as well. And so we'll have, I have a lot of thoughts on it, and, whatever you guys want to hear about it, we'll talk about that in the mailbag. So go ahead and get those questions in. But Mr. Trowbridge, without further ado, we're going to kick things off with talking about breakout players, and to set the stage for the overall conversation before we dive into the specifics of both sides of the ball. What we're looking at here are breakouts to any level. And we've said before, breakouts can really be on 3 levels. Number 1 is a guy that just never played or had very little snaps or meaningful snaps last season, that jumps into a really key rotation role. Doesn't have to necessarily be a guy that becomes like a star, but a guy that goes from not having played to being an impactful player. An example of that for the 24 season would be Jaden Alsbury. Didn't, redshirted in 2023. Came out last year. Don't know that he started a single game last season. Was not the best linebacker, but he was very productive. That is a breakout, a guy that went from not having played to a very key rotation spot. There are guys who maybe were starters or rotation guys that become, good starters, or I should say maybe rotation guys that become quality starters. Maybe they were, played a little bit, didn't necessarily play a ton. They step into the role and they become impactful players. And so, we could look at different players that Notre Dame had in that regard this past season. It could be Emil Wagner would be one that'd be kind of similar to what like Jaden Alsbury was. You never played, becomes a really important starter. He'd be more of that. He's more of that second level guy where he was more of a backup in 2023, becomes an starter, a pretty important starter this past season. Not necessarily a star, but a good football player. And then there's some guys that go from the bottom to the top. Those where a guy like a Don Schuler, who not only went from not playing much in 2023 to difference maker in 2024. Drake Bowen would be a guy like that second category that I'm talking about where, Don went from nothing to something. Drake was a rotation guy in 2023. Didn't play a ton, played a lot on special teams, and he became a really impact starter. Whereas like a Don went from hardly playing at all to impact player. And then there's the guys that have like the big breakouts, the guys that become star players or real big difference makers at some point in time in the season. And so we're gonna kind of, you can include any of those, and they can all fall into the category. We're gonna talk about it. We want to hear your guys' all you guys and gals' opinion as well. We're gonna do defense first, but number one, what do you think of our breakout players, and does that matter? Do you think it can have an impact? And then also, who do you guys think are the most important? And so it's not just, and here's the one caveat: no quarterbacks today. We're going to leave quarterback conversation for a different time, but it's more so which ones are needed for this team to have the biggest impact. So if Aeneas Williams has a breakout, that's awesome. It's great. If Jadarian Price has a breakout, that's awesome. That's great, but it doesn't necessarily move the needle at that position, right? I mean, if a Don Schuler goes from really good to really, really good, that's great, but that's not something that like, oh my gosh, this team isn't going to reach their full potential if, that doesn't happen, right? It's more so what are the ones that are going to have the greatest impact on this team achieving its full potential and each unit achieving its full potential. So, and that's kind of, that's kind of where we're coming from on this. We're trying to look at it from more of a need standpoint than just predicting insert really good player who's going to become, like Leonard Moore's not a guy we're going to talk about today because we both anticipate Leonard Moore being a breakout player this year. Kind of was a breakout player last year. He's getting preseason All-American honors, but like him becoming an All-American this year is just kind of a continuation of what he's already done. It's a position they're already strong at. And I don't know that it moves the needle per se. They went to the championship game with Christian Gray and Leonard Moore already playing a certain level. Breakouts are nice, makes them better, but it's not needed per se for this team to be really good. And so we're going to talk about that and look at it from more of a need standpoint. I think that's what's going to make this a little bit different than maybe some of the other breakout conversations. And so, and you guys can follow along with our criteria, or you can go with whatever you want. We just want to kind of hear what your guys' thoughts are on breakout players. So, Trev, we're going to start off with the Notre Dame defense. And this is a side of the ball that is really intriguing because there's almost kind of like this expectation that they're just going to keep cruising along. A lot of guys coming back. Yes, you've got a new D coordinator, but the rest of your staff is back. There's this assumption that Marcus Freeman's going to just, he's the head coach, so the defense is going to continue to be good. And that all sounds fine, and that's great. And we kind of believe that to a degree as well for 2025. But in order for that to happen, we both believe that there are certain players or position groups that really have to play better or provide something beyond what they provided last season in order for this to actually happen. Now, we both expect it to happen, but it's dependent upon certain things kind of taking, a step, players taking a step. And so that's what we're going to focus on first is really looking at this defense and saying, what are the four players, the two players each? What are the players whose emergence is most important to this defense? A, minimum maintaining what they were, or B, potentially even being better on defense in 2025. And so I'm going to let you start off with who your first player is, Trevor. Tell me who it is, and let's dive into why that breakout is so important.
For me, when we talked about this before the show started, I went with an entire position group, but through thinking about it, I've kind of whittled it down to one person. And to me, that's Bryce Young on the edge. I was originally going to go with an edge player in general, but the more I sat down and I thought about it, Bryce Young, of the players that played a good amount of snaps last year, starter level snaps-ish, because there were points in the season where RJ Oben would be the starter. Bryce Young would end up with more snaps than him at the end of any given game, especially towards the latter half of the season. And then I went through and I looked at it, and of those players not named Boubacar Traore, who's coming back off of injury, I believe that Bryce Young has the highest ceiling of those guys, of Junior Tuihalamaka, of a Josh Burnham. Even though those ceilings are still high, I think Bryce Young, with his frame and how many snaps he got at such a young age, provides such a needed element to this edge rushing defense that it just hasn't had in a while. Javonte Jean-Baptiste did a pretty good job in 2023. We started to see hints of an edge presence with Boubacar Traore, Jordan Botelho this past season, until unfortunately their seasons got cut short. Neither of them made it past 5 games played because Boubacar got injured middle way, if that, against Louisville. So for me, I look at this in a couple of different ways. One, I think it's really easy for fans specifically, myself included in this, to say, well, if Boubacar comes back healthy, then Notre Dame's D-line is good. It's like, well, what if he comes back not at the same level as he was on September 28th against Louisville? What if it takes him some time to get back into the swing of that? Which could very well be the case.
And it would be totally natural and understandable. And
absolutely. Common. Absolutely. And so when you're going through spring, Boubacar's now 6 months removed from his knee injury. Same with Jordan Botelho. And so I would be shocked if they're doing any sort of live drills 6 months removed from an ACL knee injury. But in that time, you need other players to step up. And yes, the reason why I started out with position groups, the position group first, is one of Junior Tuihalamaka, Josh Burnham, a Logan Thomas. One of those guys absolutely could fit into that rotation. But for me, I look at Bryce Young, with him having the highest ceiling, him having the physical tools to be not only a great pass rusher, but a really good edge run defender as well. He's somebody for me that I sit back and look at. This is a guy where what he did freshman year, just based on raw talent alone, his skill set shined. He had a sack against Curtis Rourke in the first round of the playoff. He had some block kicks. So the athleticism shined, but we're going to need to see more of that on a consistent basis. And that starts in the spring. I love to start having these conversations. Like as soon as the season ends, you start talking about, man, it'd be cool if this guy could step up and do this. And man, wouldn't it be nice if player A goes crazy in the spring or player B shows what we believe that he can show. But Bryce Young is a guy, when you start talking about a need, they need an additional presence on the edge to complement Boubacar coming back, to complement Jordan Botelho coming back. I love Logan Thomas's ceiling, but when we're talking about snaps and who played more snaps and who had more pass rushing snaps, it's Bryce Young by a pretty big margin. So starting out for me, that's where it's at. Their edge rushing presence, it wasn't fully there with consistency last season, not due to talent per se, but some of it due to experience, a lot of it having to do with injury. So Bryce Young, for me, is the first player on defense that really needs to step up this spring and say, hey, I'm here, I've arrived. Regardless of when these two other guys come back and the development of the other people, I'm going to take charge and really hone in on my development to be a key piece on that defense, Bryan.
Can I ask you a question on that, Trevor? When you look at the spring, what is the level of what would be evidence to you that Bryce is starting to take that? Because this was asked of me in the receivers article. What are you going to see? I wrote an article about the sophomore receivers at Irish Breakdown, and it was about how they're going to have a chance to break out and the impact that they could have. And the question was, well, what like with Cam Williams, what will it mean for you to see that you're saying breakout is coming? What were the things that you're going to be looking for from Bryce, and what's the minimum level of performance or production that you need to see to say, like, there's different types of breakouts for a guy like Bryce, right? One is he becomes, he was a good flashy player, becomes more steady. The other one is he becomes a difference maker. The third one is like he becomes like a dude, which is what we think ultimately he becomes. Maybe not 25, we'll see. But like, what's the minimum of what you need to see from him? First of all, what's it look like? And then what's the minimum you need to see from him to say, okay, Bryce is taking that step?
Yeah, for me, it comes down to consistency. That is a huge thing for me because, to your point, we saw the flashes from him. So in the spring, it's him being constantly disruptive. When you're going through and you're looking at practice, barring any number change, you see number 30 in the backfield more plays than not. It's not you go through an entire team period and once in a while, do you see that play that Bryce Young made? It's, gosh, man, he's just in the backfield again. Man, he set the edge really well again. So for him, it's that level of consistency. It's going to be a huge thing for me this spring because Notre Dame has a talent at every position on this team to have great impact players, difference makers, which is Bryce Young is one of those players that we believe to get there at some point. But for me, it's the consistency, that level of consistency from him specifically. Because one, not only is that going to help his development, I think that's going to help the other players' development as well. You have a guy like a Josh Burnham or a junior Tui Alamakasi and a kid that's younger than them. And gosh, man, he is just tearing it up every play, every drill, every team run, every insert practice drill here. So bare minimum for me, that's what it looks like. Just consistency, consistent disruption in the pass rush and in the run game.
I think if he really steps up as a pass rusher, I think that could be something that would be huge as well. And I also feel like if one of those two has to step up as an impact pass rusher, and I feel like if Bryce steps up as an impact pass rusher, that takes a little bit of the pressure off of Josh to be that guy, and Josh can be more of that impact run guy. I mean, it was what you're talking about the Indiana game and the pressure, but I mean, Josh had a huge play, first play of the game. There were about 3 or 4 plays that Josh was really good there. You think of that tackle for loss against Penn State. Like, that's just where Josh has been pretty good so far. And you'd like to have a little bit more of a complementary piece to that group, in my opinion. That's just kind of my 2 cents on that. I just feel like that would be something that would be super impactful, for that duo to make me feel like, okay, they're really stepping up, and I'm seeing some real impact production from that duo. You and I kind of had a couple thoughts along a similar lines, Trev, when you talk about the defensive line. I'm going to stay on the defensive line for my first one, and I have an individual player in mind, and it's Gabriel Rubio. And when I look at the defensive ends, we broke them down a lot last week, Trev. We talked about how important they are. You need Bryce to step up. You need Josh Burnham to take his game to another level. The exciting thing is kind of feel this way about receivers too, but we started to see some flashes from guys who didn't do certain things during the regular season or any consistency. So you hope that they can build on that. But the big thing for me is you can't take a big step back at defensive tackle. I expect there to be some, maybe early in the season, potential for a step back based on how they were in November. But what you can't see is a step back from where you were in the postseason. You've got to be better than what you were in the postseason. And because in the postseason, like, we're thinking, well, you can't sound fair to ask Gabriel Rubio and those guys to replace, Howard Cross and Riley Mills. Well, I'm not asking them to replace November version of Riley Mills or Howard Cross. I'm asking them to be better than what January version of Howard Cross was. And we didn't see Riley Mills in January. You know what I mean? So it's like I needed to be better than what it was against Georgia and Penn State, especially Penn State and Ohio State. Because I thought the D tackles were like, I thought Gabriel Rubio was my pick here. And I thought he's pretty good against Georgia for the most part. But the thing with Gabriel is that he's shown so many flashes of being a difference maker that it almost kind of gets frustrating sometimes when he doesn't play with the consistency that he's capable of and doesn't have the impact that he's capable of. Because for 3 years now, we've seen flashes of him where at moments you're like, dude, that was a really impressive play. That's the former top 100 recruit that we all remember. That's the guy that had like 20 sacks as a senior that we remember. Like, that's the guy we thought we were getting. That's the guy that won MVP honors at Notre Dame's lineman camp when he was coming out of high school. Like, that's what I remember about. That's what we thought Gabriel Rubio was going to be. And he's never quite been that player. Now, he's obviously been good for Notre Dame. He's been a key rotation player now for 3 seasons. This will be, 4th season. And third, he's a really important cog to this. But a couple things from Gabriel. Number one is he hasn't been able to stay on the field consistently. Last year it was because of, there were some injuries he was dealing with, right? He also wasn't with the team in the spring. because of things going on with him. He had some injuries he dealt with in 23. So, A, he's got to stay healthy. But this is his chance to really step into the lineup and say, hey, I am that guy. I am that guy that can, I did my job. Want to know why I didn't flash maybe as much as people would have liked the last couple of years? Because that wasn't my job. That wasn't my role. My role was to come in and do this, and I did that. Cool. All right, great. But now you need him to kind of step up and be that guy. And there's other D tackles, like Jared Rhodes just talking about Armel Mukum, and that would be great to see Armel break out. I don't think they need Armel to break out. If he breaks out, that's awesome. The reason that I'm looking at Gabriel as my breakout player that's the biggest need at D tackle is because he's the guy that, to me, can provide the biggest boost in production. If Armel Mukum breaks out, it basically means he is Riley Mills again. That's phenomenal. It's great. But what Notre Dame hasn't had really in years is that 310 to 15 pound force against the run that can also give you some disruption in the pass game. And Gabriel was not that. He was not overly disruptive this season. Had some flashes against Georgia, but he's got to take his game to another level because I think he's capable of being a really good football player. I don't see a guy that's going to be 10 tackles for loss and 7 sacks. Like, I don't see Jerry Tillery in him. I don't see a guy that's going to necessarily have like elite production in the tackle standpoint like Howard Cross did 2 years ago when he had 66 tackles. But I see a guy that can be an absolute force up the middle because of his size, because of his power, because of his motor when it's running hot, and because of his playmaking potential. I think he has the tools to be very much a difference maker in this defense, especially against the run. And that is the one area on defense where I think this team can and must make the biggest improvement this offseason. I'm not someone that believes that Notre Dame has to go out and hold teams like 80 yards a game on the ground. That doesn't mean it as much to me because the game has changed. Sometimes I'm willing to give you 120 yards rushing because it's not going to let you throw the ball on us. We saw Notre Dame do that at times last season. But it's got to be better than what it was. Look, you can't give up over 200 yards in back-to-back playoff games. And you just can't. You can't allow Northern Illinois to do to you what they did to you. If you think about the last 5 games, held Indiana to 63 yards, great performance. Held Georgia to 62 yards, great performance. But sandwiched around those 2 games was 197 yards allowed rushing against USC, 7.0 per carry, 204 to Penn State, and 214 to Ohio State. When the game was on the line, in the third quarter, your team is down. You need a stop at the beginning of third quarter to get your offense the ball so you can try to climb back in this game. You almost immediately give up a 70-yard run and eventually give up points to them. That kind of stuff has to improve. And if Chris Ash can just kind of maintain every aspect of this defense, just maintain what it's been, but get better at stopping the run, I think this makes this team a lot better. And Gabriel is built more for that than Howard or Riley was. Part of the reason I think that Al Golden did what he did is because neither Howard nor Riley Mills are elite run defenders. They're more disruptive pass rusher, get into the gaps kind of guys. Gabriel has the tools to be that kind of defender. And that's why I think his emergence more than anybody else at D tackle is the most needed because he has that skill set that's so unique to what just this defense needs. So that's where I'm at.
So to follow up on that, it sounds like you're in a similar boat to where I am with Bryce Young, is you need to see that level of consistency. Would you say that is your floor for Gabe Rubio of, okay, at minimum?
I just like even from snap to snap, because it'd be like, what was it? Was it the Georgia game? It was the Georgia game where like there's one snap, he just gets, maybe it's Indiana. He just gets driven. It was a playoff game. He gets driven off the ball like 6-7 yards. And then like 2 plays later, the very next play just whips his guy. And you're just like, how did those 2 plays happen that close together? Like it can be very frustrating watching Gabriel because his talent, his tools, but there's just something missing with him. There's just this level of consistency that we just don't see from him. So I think if he can just be consistent, then the playmaking takes care of itself. It's like I can't have you go through one series where it's just like you look like you're not moving your feet, you just look disinterested, you're getting knocked all around, and then the next series you look unblockable. Like I can't have that in from game to game, because as a play caller, I don't know how I'm supposed to call this series with you in the game. Which version of you am I getting? And I think that level of consistency is needed. But I think Gabriel playing consistent football means that he's a difference maker, whether the production matches or not. It could be there's going to be a game this year that if Gabriel Rubio comes out and just dominates at the point of attack, that he has 3 tackles and 1 tackle for loss. But how do we know he dominated? Number one, we watched the film, and number two, Drake Bowen had 14 tackles and 3 tackles for loss because he was just flying through gaps and blowing people up, or Kingston has 10 tackles and 2 tackles for loss, or you know what I mean? Because they're just flying to the ball because they're having to double team and they can't get off the double team of Gabriel because he's just kicking their butt and the linebackers are just flying to the football. That's sometimes how we'll see it as well. But Gabriel has the tools to be that kind of really good football player. But he's never been that guy with any kind of consistency. And again, I don't mean consistency from game to game. I mean, with Gabriel, sometimes it's series to series, and at other times with him, it's literally play to play. You're just like, you watch a series and you're like, 3 plays, he was like, what is that? And then 3 plays, you're like, what was that? That was and that's what's frustrating. But you can't have that as a defense, because as a middle linebacker, I need to know that I can count on you to do your job and do it well. And if I'm a defensive coordinator, I need to know that I can count on you to do your job and do it well. And those are things that we just haven't seen from him that he's capable of. Because I've always believed this, Trevor. If you're capable of having a play where you whoop a guy's butt for 3 or 4 plays, that's something that you should be able to do all the time. It's not, you didn't luck into, that kind of dominance. You have it in you. You just got to be able to bring it out more consistently. That was an issue for Riley Mills for a long time. For years, we talk about Riley Mills in similar fashion, including last season in 2023, where there were times when Riley Mills was like, dude, that guy's as good as any D tackle in college football right now. And then there's times like, did he play today? Like, where was he? And why was he so easy to block? Gabriel's kind of in that same fashion. Now, they're different players, but he can have that similar, if he can put it all together the way Riley did from like Louisville till the time he got hurt. That is a huge, huge, huge boost for the Notre Dame defense. And so that's why he's at the top of my list for needed breakouts for this defense and impactful breakouts for this defense. Could you imagine if Notre Dame becomes a really good top 15 caliber run defense next year on top of what we already know they can do in the pass game? That'd be fun to watch.
I just don't know. I don't know how teams score legitimately outside, barring the random big play or just when you face that one offense that just has all the star power to where it's, evens the playing field a little bit. But man, that'd be fun to watch. I know exactly what Gabe Rubio play you're talking about. It was against Georgia. Tate Ratledge blew him off the ball, drove him 4 yards in the backfield. On the next play, stoned him with one arm, and then tackled Nate Frazier with one arm on the other one. Yeah. I know exactly what play you're talking about.
You're like, how do you see that play in back-to-back? Like, How does that happen?
Yep.
Well, maybe he was ticked off then do that. Find a way to get yourself ticked off all the time.
Every play.
It's like you need to get some Bruce Banner in you. Like, that's my secret, Cap. I'm always angry. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need to actually get mad. I'm always kind of mad. So I'd love to see that from Gabriel Rubio. Who's your number 2, Trev?
My second one, I went with an overall position group, and it is I'm sticking with the safety position, and nothing to do with the Don Schuler. It's who's going to be lining up next to him. Replacing Xavier Watts has been a hot topic this offseason, and it's one that we're going to be focusing on as the spring rolls on into the summer, fall camp. And so for me, somebody in that group has to step up. We've already talked about Jalen Stroman. He's already on campus. We talked a lot about the transfers earlier this week, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. He's obviously one of the leading candidates to step into that role with his experience playing at the Power 5 level. But I wanted to focus a little bit more on some of the other players in that room that have the opportunity in spring who need to elevate their game. And I'm going to start with Luke Talich. Luke Talich is a guy where he's going into his 3rd season in the program, I believe. And he's somebody that, one, provides a lot of
Same
range.
class as a Don Schuler. They're
Okay.
in the same class. He's part of that 2023 class.
Okay. And he provides a lot of range. He's 6'4". He received, yes, he's a walk-on, and there's a lot of people that are still going to kind of dangle that over his head for a little bit, but he received, at the time, like Power 5 offers. I think he had a scholarship offer from like Oregon State. I think he had one from Utah.
And Washington State. Yeah, Washington State wanted him. And he was never brought to Notre Dame with the thought he was going to be a walk-on for more than a year. There was always, because there was even conversations with Maris Leofow and J.D. Bertrand about maybe coming in and being walk-ons for a year because they were a little tight on scholarships. Ended up not manifesting, but like that's basically like Luke Couch was not recruited in the same way you recruit most walk-ons. He was recruited like Jordan Faison was not recruited to be the impact player that he was. Like that was an added bonus. They liked him, right? But no one recruited him thinking, hey, I think he can help us as a freshman and be starting as a sophomore. Luke Couch was brought in that once Xavier's time is over, we expect you to be pushing your way into the rotation and to help us on defense, not just special teams.
And he's going to be the guy at the top of my list that needs to have a really big spring because he's one of those guys that absolutely has to step up in my eyes. Because one, out of the remaining players in that safety room, a Don Schuler aside, and we already talked about Jalen Stroman, he brings the most experience because we're also talking about, Bronte Johnson, Kennedy Urlacher, Ben Minnick, Jadon Blair, guys that haven't really seen a whole lot of minutes. I mean, and in cases like, an Ethan Long or Jadon Blair, they've seen no minutes at the college level. So Luke Talich, for me, is a guy that in the spring needs to elevate his game to where we've talked about this. I don't believe Notre Dame is going to stick with the same type of safety rotation they had this past year where, 85% of the time it's going to be both the Don Schuler and Xavier Watts on the field. Every so often you see Rod Hurd trickle in there, and then Luke Talich comes in garbage time minutes because the task of replacing Xavier Watts is not going to be a one-person job. Just won't be because, I mean, quite honestly, I don't think it can be. Just be right now because his impact was insane in 2024. More of a testament to Xavier Watts than it is the remaining candidates in that room. But Jalen Stroman, like we've talked about before, has some question marks around him. What is it going to look like if he starts playing a 13, 14 game season? What is he going to look like coming off of a shoulder injury? Luke Talich, as far as to my knowledge, is pretty healthy right now. And he's somebody that they are expecting to take a jump. He's somebody that needs to take a jump in the spring to solidify his name in that rotation to where there won't be a drop-off of, all right, Jalen Stroman's got to come out this series. Who's next? Let's go with Luke Talich. It's, it becomes more of the game plan than the necessity. That's how I look at it. Next person in that room for me is Bronte Johnson. He's somebody that all coaches rave about his athleticism. He would be higher on my list if there weren't some questions around like what position is he going to play. There's been some thought about him going to corner, maybe, what would that look like with him at nickel? But I think him as a safety, again, he still provides good size. I think he's 6'2". He's a freak athlete. He's another person that has the opportunity to step up and be, again, push Luke Talich for, hey, I need to be in this rotation. I'm too good to keep off the field for a second season in a row on defense. So you go through and you look at who's left and who's remaining. Kennedy Urlacher's name is in that discussion. He's a little bit more of the, I don't want to call it a project, but we all know what he's capable of doing in run support. For him, it's going to be, can you take that next step in pass coverage? Because let's call a spade here. As talented as this room is, they're not going to rotate 6 guys at safety. So they're going to have to whittle it down to, in my mind, 3, ideally 4, because Don Schuler also can't stay on the field at all times. Now, he will be playing the majority of the snaps on defense, but Kennedy Urlacher is another guy that has a really high ceiling. Dude flies to the football. What is he going to look like from a pass coverage standpoint? Who knows? Because Kennedy Urlacher is also not a kid that came to South Bend to play special teams for 4 years and come in and mop up duty and just lay out whatever team is down by 30 points at the time where he steps onto the field. And then obviously the final person in that rotation is Jadon Blair in that room. He has an insanely high ceiling, arguably the highest of the group. that I just talked about. He's 6'5". Hard to believe that there's a safety in that rotation that's taller than what Luke Talich is, but that's Jadon Blair. Jadon Blair is 6'5". He's really rangy. He is a lot faster than what he looks like just because he has those long strides, really long legs. He's really, really improved in coverage, like Bryan talked about when we talked about him coming in. His evolution in high school was awesome to watch. He went from, a basketball player playing football to like, hey, okay, you're starting to turn into a pretty good football player. And then his senior year, it's like, okay, you're now one of the best defensive players in the country, in my opinion, for what all you bring to the table, what all you do for your team. And so Jadon Blair is going to have to come in and continue to push to get his name in the rotation. That competition really elevates the rest of the room. And when you go through and you look at the youngest person coming in being 6'5", Jadon Blair, that's really going to push the guys in front of you. But his impact isn't only going to be felt by just pushing the older guys. He has the skill set and the talent to make his way into the rotation. Bryan and I have talked before that we believe Jadon Blair is going to play on defense in meaningful minutes, not just mop-up duty, not just on punt coverage and kickoff coverage. We think he's going to play. But in order to do so, he now has to hone in his skill set to earn those minutes. Marcus Freeman and that defensive coaching staff for the last couple of years has shown they will play young guys, not just out of necessity, but if you earn the time on the field, and Jadon Blair has that opportunity in front of him. So for me, Bryan, that's my second position group on defense.
I mean, there's players there. I mean, even Ben Minnick, who I had my lowest ranked player in the class, defensive class, when he came out, was still a guy who was a really good football player. He just staying healthy is going to be a big key for Ben Minnick. But yeah, I mean, you're correct, Trev. I mean, there's plenty of talent there, but they're all ifs. If. And would you say that you need two from that room? Did you say you need two from that room to really step up? Mm-hmm. Like you need at least one guy to step on and say, I'm the guy, and then somebody else. And obviously we talked about Jalen Stroman the other day, but this is more focusing on the returners. So even if you assume that Jalen Stroman's going to be a good, like all ACC caliber starter, you still need at least one guy. And honestly, from talking to the coaches last year, they wished that somebody they wanted a fourth guy to step up last year. They're not going to just go to four just cause, but they wanted a fourth guy to step up. So if two guys can step up, I do think the staff would like to do that, even if one of them is a guy that's maybe a bit of a hybrid that they kind of cross-train to play some nickel. So that'll be very, very interesting.
Yeah, two would be an ideal number for me, but at the minimum, in addition to Jalen Stroman, one of those guys that I mentioned has to step up in the spring. And there were moments in the national championship game where Rod Hurd, Adon Schuler, and Xavier Watts were all on the field at the same time. Some of that was Ohio State's kind of throwing the ball all over the yard right now. We got to put more DBs on the field. The cornerback room was pretty banged up. That could look a little different this year with the incoming freshman. Cree Thomas is already there. Ideally, they don't go through that devastating injury. Carson Hobbs will probably be ready to hop in the rotation this year as well. So I think it could look a little different, but we have seen in the past, Notre Dame will put three safeties on the field. So for me, an ideal number is two, minimum one. That's how I look at it, Bryan. So for your second player or position group on defense, what do you got for us?
I'm going Drake Bowen. And the reason that I'm going Drake Bowen here as a need, not just a guy that I think that's capable of breaking out, but that's a need breakout, is really twofold. And part of it is a consistent theme that I'm going with. What is the biggest area that Notre Dame has to get better on defense next season? Evidenced by the two last games where you fell behind and struggled against Penn State because you couldn't stop their run game. Yes, it's nice you stepped up in the second half, but then they kind of got it going again in the fourth quarter and had some success running the football. Ohio State ran the football effectively on you. Yes, the 70-yarder kind of padded the stats a little bit, but that 70-yarder, it happened in a very important moment. And number two, they weren't exactly like shutting it down until like the year before in 23, they shut Ohio State's run game down outside of the 60-yard touchdown run by Travion Henderson. But they still gave up that 60-yard touchdown run in a close game. And then you allow a 70-yarder against Ohio State this year that sets up another score. So like run defense has to get better, Trevor. It does. It has to get better. And so I'm sticking with the theme. And I think Drake Bowen really stepping up as going from being he was a good football player this year. Early in the season, looked like a first-time starter. By the time we got to Louisville, Drake Bowen was a pretty good football player and was a pretty good football player the rest of the year. Had his moments like as a first-year starter that you'd expect him to have, but he's a really good football player. And in the playoffs, again, some up and down moments. But Ohio State, everybody focuses on some of his rougher plays, but there were also some excellent plays in that game. And I expected sort of the up and down from him, from Kingston, from Jaden Alsbury. And I can live with it. You're now going into year 3. I expect your play to take another jump. There's no baseball for him this spring, so he'll be focused. I mean, he practiced in football last year, but he couldn't practice as much and be as focused as much because he had another sport distracting him. I shouldn't say distracting him because I support players playing 2 sports if they're good enough to do it.
Yeah,
but it is something where you have your time that's being taken by something else. That's not going to be the case this year. So I think him really stepping up and becoming that high volume tackler, thumper against the run is certainly something he's capable of and something they need to do to improve as a defense. But that's only one part of it for Drake. The other part of it for Drake is just improving his all-around game, right? Being a little bit more effective as a blitzer. Maybe next year that blitz where he hits, because Drake had 3 of the biggest hits Notre Dame had in the playoffs, and they were all on quarterbacks, on pressure. He was just a second late, right, getting there. And on 2 of those, they completed long throws. Maybe his timing improves just a little bit, and he's a half a foot further downfield, and those hits become the ball flutters. Getting a little bit better. He's got to get better. He was actually solid in coverage in zone this year, but he was a guy that could be taken advantage of in some play action and some screen stuff. We know Northern Illinois took advantage of him in that regard. Georgia took advantage of him in that regard. Penn State took advantage of him in that regard. That's an area where Drake's game has to improve, which I fully expect it to improve. And so I think as good as he was this season as a first-year starter, I think Drake Bowen has a whole nother level he can get to, and I expect him to get to it and become sort of that next great Notre Dame middle linebacker. And they really haven't had a great, like, high-volume, just impact middle linebacker really since Tavon Coney in 2018. J.D. Bertrand was excellent. And he was but part of what made JD so good was he was just a great leader and he was a clutch playmaker. But JD as a middle linebacker was never that high volume, meaning like 100 tackles, 10 plus tackles for loss kind of guy. That doesn't take anything away from how good JD was or how important he was. But I think Drake has a chance to. If any linebacker is going to break out into All-American caliber status this year, I think it will be Drake as a middle linebacker. But he's got to take his game to another level to be there. Now, here's the other piece where Drake's breakout is huge for this team. Jack Kaiser was an exceptional leader for Notre Dame last year. Exceptional leader on and off the field. That void has to be filled by somebody. And Drake makes the most sense from a experience standpoint. He's the middle linebacker. I expect him to have the green check on his helmet this year for the communications, and he's got the most natural leadership skills of anyone coming back that's a veteran. Kingston, to me, has captain traits, but he's a sophomore. And even though I expect Kingston to have a shot to step into the starting lineup this year as the starting will, which we'll get to at some point in time here down the road, I'm not asking Kingston to be a leader this year, just like I didn't ask Drake to be one last year. With Drake, it's like, dude, you do your job. Let Kaiser lead. But now Kaiser's gone. You're a second-year starter. Now it's time for you to lead. And we saw him take charge a lot on the field last year. I mean, I still think of that play against USC where it's third down, and Drake, they did something. I think they just did a backfield check, and all of a sudden Drake is like going crazy, yelling at the defense, getting upset, and then the ball snaps, and he flies right to where the ball's going to be, and they blow it up on third down. You're like, okay, he's figured it out. You know what I mean? Now it's also, now you're the guy that's got to be in charge of making sure Kingston's coming along the way that Jack did with you. Now you're the guy that has to make sure Jalen and Jaden are doing what they need to do as teammates. Not that they aren't, but that's just part of your job. It's your job to bring along Madden Faramo the way that J.D. Bertrand brought you along in 2023 as a true freshman. Drake Bowen has benefited. We talk a lot about how Adon benefited from playing with Xavier Watts. Drake Bowen got to play with two great, all-time great captains linebacker captains for Notre Dame. Now, not all-time greats in like they were the greatest linebackers to ever do it, but they were great captains in J.D. Bertrand and Jack Kaiser. And now it's his turn to step into that role. And so he's going to benefit greatly from them. And I've talked to somebody that's very close to Drake who talked about how impactful JD was to him as a freshman. JD Bertrand did not look at Drake Bowen as like this top 100 recruit that's trying to come take my job. He looked at Drake Bowen saying, this guy's going to take my job someday when I'm gone, and my job is to make sure he's as ready as possible to help this team win when I'm gone, whether I get injured at some point in time or when I graduate, go to the NFL, and it's his turn. And JD took a lot of pride, from what I'm told by not the coaches or JD Bertrand's dad calling me and because I've never talked to his dad, calling me and telling me, hey, do you know how great? No, this is coming from people around Drake. The way that JD kind of took him under his wing and brought him along, that's called tradition. That's called being a leader. That's called someone who cares about my program beyond just my impact on it. That's what the offensive line has been, what has made it so great. That's what Harry Heastan instilled in those offensive linemen. Is your job isn't to just do your job. Your job is to make sure that the next generation of guys are ready to come along and do the job when you're gone. And the fact that JD had that type of mentality, Jack Kaiser had that type of mentality, should help Drake. But now you're a junior now, bruh. Now it's your turn to be that guy. And so when you've got Madden Faramo and Bodie Cahoon and Anthony Sack and these young guys, your job is to now bring them along, by setting the example from how you work on a daily basis. And then the other is just also being that leader in the room. And he's more than capable of it, to the point where if Drake Bowen's not a captain this year, I'll literally be shocked. Like I might actually be speechless for a whole 30 seconds, which for me is a long time to be speechless. So that's what I expect from him. So for Drake, it's the playmaking in the run game, the production level, the improvements in the pass game, where he's just got to get better at not being so like, you can't let teams be able to get you the way they got you with those big plays in the pass game. But it's also the leadership. There's two play, and it's crazy. They're both true juniors. You brought up safety. I'm bringing up linebacker. I really don't. You're going to write an article about this, Trevor. But honestly, I've never been less concerned about defensive leadership in my life than I have the last couple of years as Notre Dame has transitioned from losing JD and losing Cam Hart as captains, knowing that you've got Jack Kaiser and Xavier Watts coming along and Riley Mills coming along. And now those guys are gone. And it's like, yeah, I fully expect Drake Bowen and a Don Schuler to step into those voids, and perhaps some other guys that you've brought in through the portal and things like that. But like, I expect that leadership to kind of be there. It says a lot about the culture that Marcus Freeman's building, that just, we don't really think about who the captains are going to be on that side of the ball anymore. But it also speaks volumes about the type of young men they're recruiting into the program. They're not just talented, but they're also the character that they have, the football IQ they have, the leadership traits that they have shown in high school. No one that covered a Don Schuler and Drake Bowen's high school careers is going to be at all shocked that these kids both might be junior captains at Notre Dame. No one. But that's what's now expected of you. And so that's why Drake is my number 2 guy on defense.
I like that you went with Drake. And I'm going to kind of allude back to a question that you asked me when I brought up Bryce Young. And I think it's going to be interesting for some people to try to measure what that looks like for Drake, because he was so productive in 2024. So for you, because we're going to be at the practices, we're going to see it, we're going to see the reports, we have the contacts with inside of the program. So for you, what is it going to look like to know that Drake is trending in that direction?
For me, most of what I want to see this spring is just hearing that the leadership is taking control. That's really the big thing for me. And then the other part is just the consistency of assignment, of just knowing what to do, knowing where to be at all times, and just getting there a step faster than he did last year. Whenever Drake Bowen was a step late, it was never about his athleticism. That's one of the things that I've heard people mention that I think is one of the most head-scratching critiques that I've heard of a player. Like, there's a lot of things you can say about Drake Bowen, a lot of players, but when I hear people tell me that he doesn't run well enough, I'm like, yeah, we're watching a different kid. There's a difference between not being where you need to be because you're not quite certain that you're supposed to be there and you don't have the athleticism to get there. Drake Bowen's got plenty of athleticism to make plays, and we saw it. I mean, he was such an impactful playmaker. But like all sophomores, I mean, Adon Schuler's this way. Adon was an excellent player last year, but Adon made a lot more mistakes than Xavier did. Well, yeah, Xavier's a fifth-year senior and Adon's a true sophomore. You expect that. But you don't just assume. I mean, yes, you assume that it's going to get better, but you still need to see it.
Yeah.
And that's where I am with like Adon. That's where I am with Christian Gray. That's where I am with Leonard Moore. That's where I am with Drake Bowen. A lot of these young guys, Jay Nalsbury, is I was okay with a lot of the mistakes you made last year. I expected those mistakes to happen. But now you're a junior, and we need to see those things become decreased. Now, the one of the good things that I heard from talking to a couple people that know people around Ohio State or cover Ohio State, and I've heard this from 4 or 5 different people, is the one thing that people will praise Chris Ash for is he has a belief that and he talked about it yesterday to a degree, but he's one of those coaches that believes that it's not so much how much we have in, but it's that the players know everything they need to do and that they can play as fast as possible. Let the talent take over. And I think with the talent Notre Dame has coming back at linebacker next year, they don't need to reinvent the wheel with all these crazy schemes and stunts. Not that that's what they did. I'm just speaking in general. You don't need to do all that. It's let them run to the ball because they're really athletic. And so I think that should mesh well with who Drake is. And so it's consistency is really the big thing for Drake. Eliminating, because when Drake makes mistakes, because this is the nature of playing middle linebacker, they tend to be big plays. Bad run fits on the run, gash play. You're peeking in the backfield as a running back is running past you, big play. That's what he has to eliminate. And it's that on top of we're just hearing like, yeah, Drake's like, it's a no-brainer, like captaincy. He's doing the leadership thing. So it's just that consistency, which I think is what you talked about Bryce Young, Trevor. It's like that's what we're talking about with young players that are really talented. It's not, hope he gets a little bit faster, a little bit stronger. It's like he needs to do his job at a more efficient, effective level. And that's what it comes down to, because that's when the talent takes over. And that's going to be true for Jaden Alsbury. That's going to be true for Kingston. That's going to be true for Jalen Sneed. But it's also why I'm so excited about this linebacker core, because the talent's all there. But now we need to see that step. And Drake's one of those guys that I think can go from being a good football player in 2024, which is what he was. He was a good football player. He wasn't an elite football player. He was a good football player. If your middle linebacker's not good, at the minimum good, you're not going to have the defense Notre Dame had last year, and you're not going to go 14-2 in that system and go to the national championship game, because we already seen from Al Golden's first 2 years how important middle linebacker was in his defense. You don't do what they did last year if Drake Bowen's not a good football player. But now Drake needs to go from being a good football player to a difference maker. A guy that we talk, who'd be the linebacker that could maybe contend for All-American honors? That's the guy that's got to be that guy. And then when we get into the fall, we can talk more about numbers and stuff like that. But for the spring, it's just about consistency, and that I want him leading the defense. I want him to be that one guy that everybody more so than anybody else looks to be that Manti in 2012, the emotional leader, the Alohi Gilman in 2018, who was the emotional leader. That's what I want him to be, not just making sure everybody's getting lined up, but that as well. And that's asking a lot of a true junior. But I think Drake's got the shoulders to be able to handle it. But you got to be careful as a coach that you don't ask so much of him in that regard that it then creates maybe some mistakes for him or issues when it comes to doing his job the right way. It's more important that he gets his job down first this spring And then the real big leader captain stuff can come in the fall. But the foundation of leadership that you establish now is what will lead to you becoming a captain in the fall. And that's what I want to see from Drake this spring. So let me ask you this, Trev. I know we're going to go to offense next, but I am curious. Who are some guys that you considered for this that maybe you didn't pick, that you're like, man, I wish Bryan would have let me pick 3 or let me pick 4? Was there anybody else that you looked at and said, hey, that was a guy that I had a tough time not going to?
In a way, to be honest with you, 2 of them that I would have chosen were players that you mentioned. Gabe Rubio along the defensive line, Drake Bowen in the linebacking core. The other people for me that I considered needed to step up in more of a rotational role, just based on what we saw of last year and with it being a longer season. But I mean, all the players that we had mentioned have the opportunity or are currently starters on that defense outside of the safety position. But for me, the other players that I thought about a Carson Hobbs for a little bit, because a lot of people are talking about, you know what, Notre Dame has Leonard Moore. They have Christian Gray. That's a solid opportunity to be one of the best defensive backfields in the country. They got Mark Zachary and Dallas Golden and Creed Thomas coming in. I think Carson Hobbs gets forgotten about a little bit. From what I had heard and from the things that I had read, he had a really good postseason of practice where he was starting to come along to where if something were to happen to one of the starting corners as the season started to progress, they started to feel more and more comfortable about Carson Hobbs inserting himself to get more snaps. He's somebody for me that I think in the offseason in the spring needs to build on what he did in the winter being in January, and really carry that into the spring, because depth at corner is also going to be huge. We saw last year, I mean, players get hurt. Christian Gray missed a game this past season. Ben Morrison was done after the Stanford game. So you always need to make sure you have all hands on deck. I know we're going to talk about it later, but, you know, Jawan Sider talked about how, you know, he talks about the 4th guy in the room. He prepares them the same way he does as the number 1 guy in the room, because you never know when you need your number 4 guy to be your number 1 guy. I think Carson Hobbs is somebody that has the opportunity to really make a big impact in the spring. He was somebody else that I thought about Armel Mukum. And then I also thought about Madden Faremo. And those are just people that are, like I said, adding depth. Barring an insane jump or an injury, Madden Faremo is probably not going to start for Notre Dame in the fall, just with everything that's in front of him. Not for a lack of talent. And then Armel Mukum, same thing. I think between the two, he has more of the ability to start than what Madden Faremo did. But Armel Mukum's another guy that needs to bring his development along, because they're going to rotate their defensive tackles. We talked about Jared Dawson. We don't know what kind of snap load he can bring on. Gabe Rubio needs to stay healthy and be a part of the team for a full cycle of a season. Elijah Hughes is an unknown. Armel Mukum's another guy for me that needs to step up in the spring.
I really thought about Armel. Josh Burnham was one that I thought about, but Josh is going to be more of a fall guy for me. I don't know that with what I want to see from Josh is something we'll necessarily see in the spring, unless he has that pass rush jump. He's a guy that I really thought long and hard about. But I felt the reason I didn't go with Josh is because I feel like if Josh Burnham just stays who he is, but is more consistent, that's fine. You know, like a jump would be nice. I think he's capable of it, but it's not something that I think they need for this defense to take another step. But if he has a breakout that we expect from Bryce Young, then great. It's just somebody needs to have it. I think Bryce is his skill set's geared more towards the pass rushing side of it. That was kind of where I thought about Kingston, but Kingston breaking out or Jaden Ausberry breaking out isn't necessarily a need. And it's not something I really thought much about, because I know between him, Jalen Sneed, one of those 3 is going to be like, I got the will position down, if not all 3. And there's a 4-man. I mean, it's just a level of confidence in that linebacker room that probably shouldn't have there. And, you know, we talked about, we're not going to focus too much on Patojo and Boubacar this spring. This is spring breakouts. Those guys I just want to know that they're healthy this spring. I don't need to see anything. I don't know that we will see anything from them based on their injuries this spring. These are more spring breakouts and guys that we need to see kind of take that jump now, or start to take that jump now. So those are my options. I thought about like a Donovan Heinisch and But like, I just need you to keep doing what you're doing, man. And I don't know that there's another level for him to get to because of some of his limitations, but I don't need him. I just need you to keep doing what you're doing. That's going to be the big key. So, Christian Gray is a guy that I thought about looking at, but he's going to be more of a guy that I'm going to probably focus on more in the fall as well. So that's kind of where I'm at with that one. So that's defense, Trev. We're going to move on to the offense next, folks. But do us a favor, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Subscribe to this podcast. Subscribing to this podcast is great, but obviously the notification allows you to know when we're going to go live with the show. Also, if you're listening via podcast platform, we would greatly appreciate if you guys could go on to whatever platform you use and give us a 5-star review. It definitely helps us out. It's something you can do that's free. It's something that you can do that only takes a couple minutes. Just go to wherever you subscribe to our channel. It says, rate this or review, and you leave us a 5-star review, and then just tell people what you like about our show. We really appreciate it. We would really appreciate it, and it certainly helps spread the word about Irish Breakdown. So if you can do that for us, we would greatly appreciate it.